You are not going deaf. Someone has been putting something in your drink. No one expected that warning to come from the three-year-old daughter of the housekeeper, a deaf child who could not speak, who only knew how to talk with her hands. In the middle of the most extravagant engagement party of the most powerful mafia dynasty in New York, the little girl quietly reached up and took the hand of the most powerful man in the underworld, and then began to sign in desperation. For months, Lorenzo DeLuca had believed he was slowly losing his hearing because of all those years spent living amid blood and gunfire. But if those tiny, fragile gestures were true, then the most dangerous person in his entire life had never been the enemy out there. Now stay with us all the way to the end of this one. We promise you the final twist in this story is the kind that leaves you sitting in silence for a long, long time before you can even react. You will want to know what a barefoot little girl with a one-eyed rabbit did to a man who ruled half of New York. You will want to know how a woman in a wine-red gown, sipping champagne under a chandelier that cost more than most people's homes, managed to fool a mafia king for 3 years. And you will want to know what Lorenzo DeLuca did the night he finally understood who was really sleeping beside him. So pour yourself a coffee, turn off the lights, and let the world outside disappear for a little while. All right, let us begin. The night was supposed to be perfect. The kind of night that ended up photographed on the front page of society magazines, whispered about at country clubs, replayed in the memory of every guest who was lucky enough to be invited. The DeLuca estate sat on the outer edge of New York like a crown resting on the neck of the city. 4 stories of white marble, Corinthian columns imported from a quarry in Tuscany, an iron gate 3 meters tall, wrought by hand a century ago, patrolled that night by 12 bodyguards in black tailored suits, earpieces tucked discreetly, hands never far from what those hands were trained to do. Beyond the gate, the driveway curved through rows of cypress trees lit softly from below, ending at a fountain where marble angels poured water that caught the moonlight like liquid silver. Inside, 300 guests filled the grand ballroom. There were allied dons from Chicago, who had flown in on private jets that afternoon. There were the Bostonians, quieter, older, their wives dripping in emeralds. There were the Miami men with their gold cufflinks and their sunburned smiles. There were 2 federal judges standing near the bar, pretending not to know each other. There was a senator campaigning for re-election, laughing a little too loudly. There were the most powerful attorneys on the East Coast, the ones whose phone calls could end careers. And scattered among them, like decoration, were the beautiful people whose only job that night was to make the room look expensive. The chandeliers were Italian crystal, hand-cut in Murano. The champagne was Dom Perignon, chilled to exactly 6 degrees. The cigars were Cuban, kept in a humidor older than most of the guests. The air smelled of Chanel and cedar smoke and money, the specific kind of money that has been in a family long enough to stop needing to prove itself. And in the center of that ballroom stood Lorenzo DeLuca, 38 years old, tall, broad through the shoulders, with a strong jaw that had been broken once at 22 and set by a doctor who no longer practiced. A faint scar traced the underside of his left jawline, a souvenir from an ambush in a parking garage the year he turned 24. The night he had become a man his enemies stopped underestimating. His hair was dark, cut short, threaded with the first hints of gray at the temples. His 3-piece suit was charcoal, tailored 2 months earlier in Milan by a man whose grandfather had dressed Lorenzo's grandfather. He shook hands. He kissed cheeks. He accepted congratulations with a smile. The smile was rehearsed. It always had been. It was the smile of a man who had learned very early in life that the greatest weapon a powerful man carried was the ability to never reveal anything true. To everyone in that room, Lorenzo DeLuca was the image of a man who had everything: an empire, a name, a woman on his arm who could have modeled for a Renaissance painter, a future that stretched forward like a marble hallway. But something was wrong. Something had been wrong for 4 months. He could not explain it. He could not point to a specific moment when it had started. He only knew that beneath the perfect night, beneath the perfect smile, beneath the perfect life, something inside him was quietly, patiently, coming apart. Across the ballroom, moving through the crowd like a slow current of red silk, was Serena Romano, 32 years old, the only daughter of Don Salvatore Romano, the aging patriarch of the Romano family out of northern New Jersey, a name that had stood beside the DeLuca name for more than 40 years. The 2 families had shared territory, shared enemies, shared funerals. What they had never shared, until tonight, was blood. This engagement was supposed to be the moment that changed. A merger dressed as a marriage. 2 empires becoming one bloodline. Serena had been raised for this. Every posture, every syllable, every careful pause between her sentences had been rehearsed since childhood by a mother who had understood Before Serena could even walk, that beauty in their world was not a gift. It was a tool. And Serena Romano was beautiful in that specific, expensive way. Not the loud beauty of a young woman still learning what her face could do. The other kind. The kind that had been polished for so long it no longer looked like effort. Her dark hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, catching the chandelier light every time she turned. Her gown was wine-red velvet, cut close to the body, long enough to sweep the marble floor as she moved. Diamond earrings glittered at her ears, heirlooms from her grandmother, worn only on nights that mattered. Her lipstick was a shade of red that had been chosen weeks in advance, tested in 3 different lightings. She moved through the room as though she already owned it, and, in some quiet, calculating corner of her mind, she was already beginning to believe that she did. She touched the arm of an old capo from Boston and laughed at a joke that was not funny. She kissed the cheek of a federal judge's wife and told her the pearls she was wearing looked exquisite. She leaned close to a young lawyer from Philadelphia and whispered something that made him blush all the way to the collar of his shirt. Every guest she spoke to walked away from her feeling briefly, unmistakably special. That was Serena's real gift. Not the face, the way she made grown men and hardened women believe, for one honeyed moment, that they had been seen. She had waited 3 years for this night, 3 years of dinners, of laughter shaped like devotion, of gentle patience, 3 years of Lorenzo. Across the ballroom, Lorenzo watched her, and for a single second, that rehearsed smile of his came dangerously close to becoming something real. Almost. Serena caught his eye and moved toward him through the crowd, a glass of red wine already in her hand poured, always, before he had a chance to ask. She stopped in front of him, reached up, straightened the pocket square of his charcoal jacket with a slow, proprietary tenderness. Then she pressed the wineglass into his palm and smiled up at him with those perfect dark eyes. "Drink, my love. You look tired." Lorenzo took the glass. He always took the glass. He raised the glass to his lips. He did not drink deeply. He had learned, months ago and without ever quite admitting it to himself, to make the motion of drinking without always finishing what was in his hand. He did not know why. Some old, buried instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive through the ambush at 24 and half a dozen colder nights since had begun whispering to him lately, and Lorenzo DeLuca had lived long enough in his world to know that when instinct whispered, only fools asked it to repeat itself. It had started slowly, a faint ringing in his ears after dinner. A few nights, nothing more. He had noticed it the way a man notices a loose thread on his cuff briefly, without alarm, easily forgotten by morning. Then had come the strangeness, a subtle wrongness in the shape of sounds that were supposed to be sharp. The clink of a glass at the far end of a table arriving a half-second late, the voice of his driver, familiar for a decade, suddenly sounding as though it were coming from behind a closed door. Lorenzo had blamed the pressure. There was always pressure. There were negotiations in Queens, a shipment stalled at a port in New Jersey, a young capo from the Bronx who was becoming too ambitious too quickly. He had blamed the sleepless nights, the endless procession of 3 a.m. phone calls that no man in his position could ever fully escape. He had even, quietly, and without letting the thought stay long, blamed age. His body had been carrying the accumulated weight of too many years spent in a world of gunfire and explosions, and every man's body eventually presented the bill. But in the last 3 weeks, it had become much worse. There were mornings now when he did not hear his alarm at all. He would wake to the sound of his own breathing, and realize the small brass clock beside the bed had been ringing for God knew how long. There were evenings when Serena would speak to him from across the bedroom, and her voice would arrive to him as though it had traveled through deep water, slow, warped, late. He would nod at the wrong moments. He would answer questions she had not asked. He had mentioned it to her twice. The first time, she had crossed the room, kissed the corner of his mouth, and told him softly that he was working too hard. She had promised to draw him a bath. She had promised to bring him tea. The second time, she had laughed a small, easy laugh that filled the space between them like perfume. "Lorenzo, my love, you are 38, not 78. He had not mentioned it a third time. He had convinced himself, the way tired and powerful men often convince themselves, that it would pass. Tonight, amid the champagne and the toasts and the flashing cameras of society photographers, he was determined to believe it. But he needed air. He needed silence, even though silence, lately, had begun to feel less like peace and much more like a warning. He excused himself from a conversation about the stock market with a soft, practiced smile, touching the shoulder of an old broker from Boston who was in the middle of explaining, at great and unnecessary length, why the market would correct itself by spring. Lorenzo did not particularly care whether the market corrected itself by spring. He cared about the throbbing pressure that had begun to build behind his left ear, and about the way the string quartet on the far side of the ballroom had begun to sound as though it were playing in the next building over. He moved through the crowd like a slow-moving shadow, nodding at the right faces, letting his hand be shaken by the right hands, until at last he reached the tall glass doors at the far end of the ballroom. The doors opened onto the rose garden. The garden had belonged to his mother. Lorenzo DeLuca had tended it herself for 20 years, kneeling in the soft, dark soil in a straw hat and a pair of gardening gloves, refusing to let anyone else touch the bushes. She had died when Lorenzo was 15, and every man his father had ever employed had known, without being told, that the garden was not to be neglected. The gardeners still followed her original diagrams. The old rose canes were still pruned in the shapes she had loved, one long hedge trimmed into the elegant silhouette of a peacock, tail feathers curved along the far wall. Tonight the garden was lit softly from below by lamps hidden among the stones. A fountain in the center reflected the moon in trembling silver rings. The air smelled of damp earth and late roses, and the noise of the ballroom fell away behind him like a heavy curtain. Lorenzo exhaled. For a moment he simply stood, listening to the fountain, letting his ears try to remember what stillness was supposed to sound like. Then, at the edge of his vision, something moved. Just beside the wine-red velvet curtain that framed the service entrance, the small side door used by the kitchen staff, a shape shifted in the dim light. A little girl, perhaps 3 years old, dark, curly hair, tangled and falling loose across her forehead. A simple white dress, several sizes too large for her, the hem trailing along the stone step. No shoes on her feet. In her arms she clutched a stuffed rabbit, the fur worn thin from years of holding, one of its button eyes missing entirely. She pressed the rabbit against her chest, as though it were the only thing anchoring her to the ground, and she was looking at him, not shyly, not with the wide-eyed fear a child that small should have shown at the sight of a strange man in an expensive suit. She was looking directly at him, steadily, seriously, as though she had been waiting for him. Lorenzo stopped. He did not have much experience with children. Children existed in his world the way vacations existed as abstract, future concepts that Serena occasionally mentioned in the same tone she used when discussing houses in Tuscany. But something about this child made him stop completely. He crouched slowly, lowering himself until his eyes were level with hers. "Hello, sweetheart," he said gently. "Are you lost?" She did not answer. She only kept looking. "Where is your mama?" "Nothing." Lorenzo wondered if she understood English. He was already beginning to rise, ready to call for one of the staff, when the little girl did something he did not expect. She lifted both of her tiny hands. She began to sign, small fingers, careful and deliberate, shaping themselves in the still garden air. Lorenzo's heart stopped for a single beat, because he understood. For a moment he was no longer 38 years old in a charcoal suit in a moonlit rose garden. He was 7 years old, standing in the front hallway of the old family house in Brooklyn, in a pair of pajamas too big for him, watching men in dark coats carry his mother inside on a stretcher. Lorenzo DeLuca had survived a car bombing that night. The bomb had been meant for his father, Don Vittorio DeLuca, but Vittorio had been running late, and Elena had gone down to the driveway first, holding a small bag of pastries she had picked up from a bakery in Little Italy. The blast had thrown her nearly 10 meters. She had lived. Her legs had eventually healed. Her hands, miraculously, had escaped almost untouched. But her ears had never worked again. Not one word of spoken sound, for the rest of her life. She had refused to become bitter. That had always been what struck Lorenzo most about her. Even as a small boy, she had refused. Within a year of the bombing, she had begun learning sign language, and she had pulled her only son down onto the rug in the sunroom and taught him alongside her, patiently, again and again, until he could speak with her in the new silent world she now lived inside. She had told him sign to him, rather, with her steady, calm hands, that a boy who could not speak to his own mother would grow into a man who could not hear anyone. Elena had died when Lorenzo was 15, not by an enemy, by her own heart, which had grown quietly tired one autumn morning while she was watering the roses. He had not signed a single word to another human being since the day of her funeral. More than 23 years, but his hands remembered. His hands remembered everything. The little girl in the white dress was signing 2 words. 2 careful, tiny, deliberate words, formed with fingers so small they seemed to belong to a doll. Mama. Afraid. A coldness slid down the length of Lorenzo's spine, a specific, patient cold that all his years in the underworld had never taught him. He had felt fear before, and rage before, and the strange, numb calm that came in the seconds before violence. He had never felt this. This felt like something older, something quieter, something a mother might feel when she wakes in the dark and does not yet know why. He lowered himself further onto the stone, softening his hands so his own signs would be gentle and clear. "Where is your mama?" The little girl turned her head slightly and pointed toward the service door, still cracked open a few inches into the yellow light beyond. And from somewhere on the other side of that door, a sound reached him. A voice. A cold, cutting voice that carried through the thick wood, through the distant echoes of the string quartet, through the murmur of the fountain behind him. A voice Lorenzo knew as intimately as his own reflection. Serena. Lorenzo had heard Serena use many voices in the 3 years they had been together. He had heard the soft, coaxing voice she used at breakfast, when she leaned across the table with her hair still loose from sleep and asked him if he had rested well. He had heard the sharp, precise voice she used on the phone with her event coordinators, negotiating prices, correcting florists, dismissing incompetence with a single clipped syllable. He had heard the warm voice she used at family dinners with his aging aunts, the polite voice she used with senators, the low velvet voice she used in the dark of their bedroom. He had never heard this voice. He rose to his feet slowly, keeping his movements smooth so as not to alarm the child. She had pulled the one-eyed rabbit tight against her chest. Her small shoulders had curved inward the way the body of a child curls when it recognizes danger without yet having a name for it. Her dark eyes stayed on his face. Lorenzo brought a finger to his lips, then signed, softly, "Stay here. I will be right back." The little girl nodded once. A single, serious nod, like a small soldier accepting an order she did not fully understand but intended to obey completely. Lorenzo turned and stepped toward the service door in silence. His shoes made no sound on the stone. Old training, old instincts. The door had been left cracked open by perhaps 3 fingers of space, not enough to see through, but enough for sound to slip out into the garden air like smoke escaping a room on fire. Serena's voice came through the wood, sharp and low. "I told you to keep that child in her room. I told you very clearly, Sophia. Or do I need to say it in a language you actually understand?" Then another voice, softer, trembling. A woman's voice, hushed, apologetic, threaded with a soft Italian accent that turned every syllable into a small act of self-defense. "I am sorry, Miss Serena. She slipped out while I was carrying the trays upstairs. It will not happen again. I promise. It will not happen again. If that child appears in front of a single one of my guests tonight," Serena said, cutting through the other voice like a pair of shears cutting through thread, "you are finished. Do you understand me? This is not a warning. This is the end of the conversation." Silence. Then, very small, "Yes, Miss Serena, and wipe your face before you come back out. You look like you have been crying. It is embarrassing." Lorenzo stepped back from the door. He stood there for a long moment in the cool night air, the fountain murmuring gently behind him, the moon steady over the peacock hedge his mother had shaped by hand more than 20 years ago. He had known Serena could be demanding. She ran her own luxury events company. She was precise, meticulous, uncompromising. He had always filed those qualities away in his mind under the word professional, the way a man files away small doubts he does not have time to examine. But what he had just heard through that door had not been professionalism. That had been something else entirely. Lorenzo turned back toward the little girl. She was still there, still sitting on the low stone step at the edge of the garden, still watching him with those steady, dark eyes that seemed too old for a face so small. She had not moved a single centimeter from where he had left her. The rabbit was still pressed against her chest. Her bare feet were still tucked beneath the too large hem of the white dress. He crouched down slowly again, lowering his weight onto one knee so as not to tower over her. The fountain murmured somewhere behind him. From inside the ballroom, muffled by glass and distance, he could hear the string quartet beginning a slower waltz. He signed carefully. "What is your name?" She considered the question for a moment, her head tilting slightly to one side. Her tangled curls fell across her cheek. Then her small fingers moved with the shy pride of a child who had practiced her own name many times in front of a mirror. "Emma. Emma is a beautiful name," Lorenzo signed back. "Is Sophia your mama?" She nodded immediately, and something in her face brightened a small, fierce pride that had nothing to do with a party or a house or a rose garden. Just the pride of a daughter naming her mother. "Your mama loves you very much," Lorenzo signed. And then Emma, 3 years old, barefoot, small enough that the top of her curls would not have reached his hip if he had stood, looked up at him with those serious dark eyes and lifted her small hands one more time. What she signed next dropped into the center of Lorenzo's chest the way a heavy stone drops into still, dark water. Mama cries at night. I hear her. Lorenzo did not answer at once. He looked at her careful little hands, still hanging in the air between them, waiting, at the worn, one-eyed rabbit pressed against her chest, at the bare feet on cold stone, at the too large white dress that had almost certainly been sewn for another child, in another house, in another life. Something moved uncomfortably inside his chest. Something that did not know what to do with itself. How do you hear her? He signed. Emma lifted her small hand and pressed it flat against her own chest, over her heart. Then she looked up at him again. Absolutely serious. I feel it. Here. Lorenzo did not have a word ready for what that answer did to him. He was a man who had built his life on words, contracts, negotiations, promises, threats, and a little girl who had never spoken one had just outmatched every word he had ever known. A voice behind him made him rise to his feet in a single fluid motion. Lorenzo. He turned, standing in the open frame of the garden door, one hand resting lightly against the wine-red curtain, a fresh glass of champagne balanced with practiced elegance between her fingers, was Serena. Her smile was still in place. It was the same smile she had been wearing all evening, the one that had charmed capos and senators and old widows in emeralds. The chandelier light from the ballroom behind her caught in her diamond earrings and traced a soft glow along the curve of her jaw, but her eyes had traveled downward, from Lorenzo's face to the small figure sitting on the stone step behind him. And behind those eyes, something had gone very, very still. There you are, she said warmly, stepping into the garden. Her voice was the honeyed voice again, the one meant for guests and cameras. Everyone has been asking for you. She walked toward him unhurriedly, the wine-red velvet of her gown whispering against the stone. She did not crouch down to greet the child. She did not soften her face. She looked at Emma the way one might look at a stray animal that had wandered into a place it did not belong. And you, she said, her voice dropping lower now, smooth as glass. You need to go back inside to your mother. Emma looked up at Serena, and in a moment so brief, Lorenzo almost missed it, so brief that he might have convinced himself later that he had imagined it. If he had not spent his life learning to trust his eyes, the little girl leaned back. Not much. Just the smallest shift of her small body away from the woman standing over her. It was the instinct of a child, the honest truth of an animal that knows before it knows. Lorenzo saw it, and he could not stop seeing it. He returned with Serena to the ballroom. He smiled. He offered a short, warm toast about his beautiful bride-to-be that made the entire room applaud, and made Serena look up at him with that soft, rehearsed tenderness he had believed in for 3 years. He kissed her cheek in front of the photographers. He shook the hands he was expected to shake, but something had cracked inside him that night, something he could not yet name. Twice during his own toast, his hearing had cut out completely, a sudden, muffled deadness, as though someone had pressed cotton against the inside of his skull. He had smiled through it. He was good at smiling through things. Late that night, after the last guests had climbed into their cars, and the staff had begun the quiet, exhausted work of clearing the ballroom, Lorenzo sat alone in his study. The house had grown very silent around him. Only the tick of the old clock on the mantel, and the distant clatter of crystal being carried away. He picked up his phone. For 3 months he had refused to look. He had told himself there was nothing to find, that it would pass, that it was age or exhaustion or the price a man in his world eventually paid. He typed the symptoms into the search bar with fingers that had suddenly become very calm. One line stopped him cold. In rare cases, progressive hearing loss without a clear medical cause can indicate prolonged exposure to ototoxic substances. He read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the desk. The next morning, Lorenzo came down early. 6 o'clock. The house was still asleep. The great chandeliers in the front hall had been dimmed to their lowest setting. The marble floors were cold beneath his shoes, and the long windows along the east corridor had begun to catch the first pale gold of a New York autumn sunrise. Somewhere on the upper floors, a housekeeper was already moving softly, carrying folded linens. Otherwise, the estate was silent. He walked into the kitchen alone, intending to make his own coffee. It was a small, private ritual he had always insisted on doing himself. The chef would arrive at 7, 2 assistants at 7:30. Serena rarely came down before 9. These early minutes had always belonged to Lorenzo, and to Lorenzo alone a single hour in the day when he was not a don, not a fiancé, not a decision-maker for 200 loyal soldiers, but simply a man in a quiet room with a small brass grinder and a bag of Sicilian coffee beans. He was measuring the beans when he heard the softest sound from the doorway. He turned. Emma was standing there, the same white dress, wrinkled from sleep, the one-eyed rabbit in her arms, her curly hair a soft tangle around her cheeks, bare feet on the cold kitchen tile. Watching him with those steady, dark eyes, Lorenzo blinked. "Good morning, Emma," he signed. She answered. Then, carefully, with the pride of a child rehearsing a phrase she was still learning, "Good morning." He almost smiled. "Are you hungry?" She nodded. He searched the pantry, found a small loaf of country bread, and made toast. He cut the slices into small triangles. He vaguely remembered reading somewhere, long ago, that children preferred toast in triangles. He poured a small glass of orange juice from the pitcher in the refrigerator. He set both on the low breakfast table by the window. Emma climbed onto the chair with enormous dignity, arranged the rabbit neatly beside her plate, as though it, too, deserved a place setting, and began to eat. Lorenzo stood by the counter with his own coffee, watching her. They were the strangest, most unexpectedly peaceful 6 minutes he had experienced in months. Then, in the middle of a bite, Emma looked up at him. She kept one hand on her toast, and with the other, she signed. "The woman put something in your cup." Lorenzo set his coffee down on the counter very slowly. "What did you say?" He signed, keeping his face calm, his hands steady. Emma set her toast down. She used both hands now. She repeated it more clearly this time, the way children do when they realize you have heard them but they want to be sure. "The beautiful woman put something in your cup. I saw her." The kitchen became very quiet. "When?" He signed. Emma thought about it. She lifted a few fingers and counted in a way that followed no logic, the time of a 3-year-old. Then she signed. "Many times, when you were not looking." The air in the kitchen felt different. Lorenzo looked at the coffee cup in his hand. He thought about the strange, heavy fatigue that had ended so many recent evenings, about the mornings he had woken as though rising from the bottom of thick, dark water. He thought about the word he had read the night before, ototoxic. He set the cup down. He did not drink from it again. Lorenzo DeLuca was a man who built things, organizations, contracts, empires. He had spent his entire adult life learning that the men who survived his world were not the fastest or the loudest or the most brutal. They were the ones who understood a simple, patient truth. You never moved until you understood exactly what you were dealing with. Anger without information was suicide. Certainty without evidence was arrogance. And arrogance, in Lorenzo's world, was the shortest road to a shallow grave. So he did not confront Serena. Not yet. He walked back through the quiet corridors of the house with the same measured pace he had used 1,000 times, past oil paintings of ancestors who had built the DeLuca name out of stone and salt and long, cold silences. He passed the tall grandfather clock in the East Hall that his father had brought back from Palermo the year Lorenzo was born. He climbed the marble staircase to his private study on the 2nd floor. He closed the door behind him. He locked it, and he picked up his phone. He called Dr. Vincenzo Bianchi. Bianchi had been the personal physician of the DeLuca family for more than 25 years. He had treated Lorenzo's father in his final illness. He had signed the papers on Elena's autopsy report the autumn morning she had died beside her roses. He was not the doctor Serena had recommended 4 months ago. A soft-spoken specialist with an office on the Upper East Side who had assured Lorenzo, again and again, that everything was likely stress and could be observed with patience. "Vincenzo," Lorenzo said quietly when the old doctor answered. "I need a full blood panel and a complete toxicology screen. Discreet. I will explain later." There was a small pause on the line. Bianchi did not ask questions. He never had. "Come this afternoon. I will keep the office closed." Lorenzo ended the call. Then he went to find Sophia. He found her on the 2nd floor, in the east corridor, folding fresh linens into the tall cedar cabinet outside the guest suites. Her sleeves were pushed up. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tighter knot at the nape of her neck. She was moving with the small, quick efficiency of a woman who had learned to be invisible in the rooms of powerful people. She saw him coming and lowered her eyes immediately. Her jaw tightened. "Don DeLuca, I am so sorry about last night." Emma slipped out. "It is not about that, Sophia." She stopped, her hands still holding a folded sheet against her chest. "How long have you been working here?" Lorenzo asked. She looked up cautiously. "Nearly 2 years, Don." "How long has Emma been deaf?" Something complicated passed across her face. Surprise, exhaustion, a very old and very deep pain. "Since she was born, Don. She began signing at 14 months. She learns very fast." She paused, as though she had long ago taught herself not to be too proud inside this particular house. "She is very intelligent." "She is," Lorenzo said simply. He took a small step closer. "I want you to know that in this house, from this moment on, She is safe. And I want you to know that no one will ever threaten your job again. Not ever." Sophia looked at him, her eyes filled with water. She pressed her lips together tightly, gave him a single, silent nod, and lowered her face back to the folded sheets in her arms. Lorenzo turned and walked away. Behind him, in the still, sunlit corridor, he heard the softest, most contained exhale, the sound of a woman who had been holding her breath for a very, very long time. Back in the study, Lorenzo locked the door a second time. He crossed to the wide mahogany desk that had belonged to his father and to his father's father before him, and he opened the slim silver laptop that had been custom-built by a private contractor in Zurich. He typed a long string of credentials into the security interface. The screen flickered once, then bloomed into a grid of live feeds. His estate had cameras in every common space: hallways, kitchens, the ballroom, the formal dining room, the library, the wine cellar, the rear service corridors. Not the private bedrooms, and not the bathrooms. His father had drawn that line 30 years ago, and Lorenzo had never crossed it, but every other space in the house was watched, quietly and continuously, by a network of small, unblinking eyes. His hands were steady as he typed. He scrolled back 3 months, and he began to watch. He was patient. He worked in silence, 1 hour of footage after another. The way a man sifts sand looking for a single small bone, he found it in 40 minutes. It was so ordinary that anyone watching without knowing what to look for would have seen nothing at all. Serena, alone in the kitchen, at 11:17 at night, 3 months and 2 weeks earlier, walking calmly to the counter where Lorenzo's evening herbal tea was steeping in the small porcelain pot he preferred. The tea itself had been her idea, her recommendation, gently offered one evening about 4 months ago, and then quietly folded into his routine. Herbal. Relaxing. So good for the stress. My love. On the screen, Serena reached into the pocket of her silk robe and drew out a small glass vial. It was no larger than a lipstick tube. Her movements were precise, unhurried, rehearsed. She unscrewed the tiny cap with one hand. She tilted the vial over the porcelain pot. 2 or 3 drops. She recapped the vial. She slipped it back into her pocket. She lifted her phone from the counter and began scrolling through it, casually, the way a woman scrolls through her messages when she has only just heard a notification. She turned and walked out of the kitchen. Lorenzo advanced the footage. 1 week later, same time, same motion. 2 weeks after that, the same. A month later, the same. 17 times in 3 months. 17 small, patient, perfectly rehearsed gestures. 2 or 3 drops, every time. Lorenzo leaned back in his chair. He looked out the tall study window into the morning garden, where a light autumn wind was moving through the peacock hedge his mother had shaped by hand. A single yellow leaf detached itself from an old maple and drifted slowly down onto the surface of the fountain. He thought about a barefoot little girl of 3, with a one-eyed rabbit clutched against her chest, who had sat on a cold stone step in the dark and trusted a stranger enough to lift her small hands into the shape of a warning. He thought about all the things children see, and all the things adults pretend they do not. For the first time in 4 months, his mind was completely, terrifyingly clear. He told no one what he had found. Not yet. He called his personal attorney, a quiet, gray-haired man named Aldo Ferretti, who had drafted contracts for the DeLuca family for the past 18 years. He gave him no explanation. He simply instructed that a set of instructions be prepared, sealed, notarized, filed with 3 separate law firms and held until further notice. Aldo did not ask why. He never did. Lorenzo called Dr. Bianchi again. He arranged for the security footage to be copied onto 2 encrypted drives, one to remain in the house safe, the other to be stored in a bank vault in Manhattan under a name that did not appear on any DeLuca document. Then he waited 3 days for the toxicology results. He continued to move through the house as though nothing had changed. He kissed Serena's cheek in the morning. He listened to her chatter about the seating chart for the wedding, about the Tuscan villa she had reserved for their honeymoon, about the color of the linens for the reception. He nodded at the right moments. He smiled at the right moments. He did not drink a single cup of the evening tea. He did not drink the wine she poured. He ate only what came directly from the chef's hands, and drank only from bottles he opened himself. Serena noticed nothing. That in itself told him everything he needed to know about her. On the 3rd day, at 10 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, his phone rang. Bianchi's voice had that careful, specific tone doctors use when they are handing over something they wish they did not have to hand over. "Lorenzo, I need you to come in, right now." In the private examination room on the 2nd floor of Bianchi's clinic, the old doctor set a slim folder down on the desk between them. He did not sit. Gentamicin sulfate. he said quietly. Lorenzo said nothing. He waited. An antibiotic. Perfectly legal in the right medical context. But at sustained, subclinical doses, over months, in someone who has no prescription for it, it is known for one thing above all others. Bianchi tapped the folder gently. It is ototoxic. It damages the delicate structures of the inner ear. Slowly, progressively, permanently, if the exposure continues long enough. Odorless, tasteless, undetectable, unless someone thought to test for it specifically. Someone had researched this very carefully. Someone had been patient. Someone had wanted it to look like a natural decline, like stress, like age, like bad luck. Bianchi looked at him over the rim of his old wire glasses. If you had continued for another 2 months, Lorenzo, the damage would have become irreversible. You are very lucky. Lorenzo drove himself home. On the road, he thought of Serena's hands pouring his tea every evening for 3 years. He thought of her voice, warm and amused, saying, "You are 38, my love, not 78. He thought of a small pair of hands in the dark garden. The beautiful woman put something in your cup. What does a man do when he realizes that the most dangerous thing in his entire life has been sitting across from him at breakfast, smiling? That night, Lorenzo made another call. Marco Ricci arrived at the estate before dawn. He was 65 years old. His hair had gone completely white nearly a decade ago. He wore a plain dark coat over a plain dark suit, the kind of clothing a man chooses when he has spent 40 years learning that being remembered by strangers is a professional liability. He had served Don Vittorio DeLuca for more than 30 years, as consigliere the counselor, the quiet voice at the Don's shoulder, the man who spoke in a whisper and was obeyed as loudly as a shout. When Vittorio had died, Marco had stayed on for his son. He had known Lorenzo since Lorenzo was 7 years old, and still walked with a small limp from the bombing that had taken his mother's hearing. His eyes were as sharp as a straight razor. They had not softened with age. If anything, they had grown quieter. And quieter was, in Marco Ricci's world, a form of sharpness all its own. He sat down across from Lorenzo in the study. He accepted a small cup of espresso. He waited. "Marco," Lorenzo said, "I need you to dig into the Romano family. Every transaction, every meeting in the past 6 months, every capo, every contact, every phone that has spoken to Don Salvatore's phone." Marco did not ask why. He had never asked why, not once in 3 decades. He simply nodded, drank the rest of his espresso in a single, slow swallow, set the cup down, and left. 3 days later, he returned with a thick folder and placed it on Lorenzo's desk. Don Salvatore Romano had been meeting, in secret, for the past 5 months, with 4 low-ranking capos of the DeLuca family. Small men, ambitious men, men who felt they had been passed over. They had met at a quiet restaurant in the suburbs of New Jersey, in a private back room that the Romano organization had used for decades. Promises had been made. Promotions, additional territory, access to shipping routes that had been controlled by DeLuca lieutenants since Lorenzo's father was a young man. Slowly, as Marco laid the documents out one by one, the shape of the plan came into focus. After the wedding, Lorenzo would be declared unfit to lead. His progressive, mysterious illness, carefully documented by the specialist Serena, had insisted would be presented to the family council as a tragedy of nature. Serena, as his legal wife, would hold the power of attorney they had drafted 6 months earlier at her gentle suggestion. Don Salvatore would step in to assist the DeLuca organization during the difficult transition. Within 1 year, the DeLuca family would be quietly absorbed into the Romano family. No war, no blood, no headlines, only poison and patience. The empire that Lorenzo's father had built with 40 years of his life and a great deal of blood would simply, silently, cease to exist. Marco looked at him across the folder. "What do we do now, Don Lorenzo?" Lorenzo turned toward the tall study window. Outside, the wind was moving through his mother's rose garden. Petals fell in slow spirals in the October air, one by one, onto the fountain water. "We give them exactly the wedding they want," he said. "But we give it to them my way." He turned back to Marco. "Do you remember my mother, Marco? Donna Elena? Of course. Do you remember what she taught me?" Marco allowed himself a small, rare smile. "That sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that need to be listened to the most." "Yes," Lorenzo said. "Exactly that." That night, long after the house had gone quiet and the last of the staff had gone home, Lorenzo walked down the narrow corridor that ran behind the kitchen. He passed the small pantry, the linen room, the back staircase used only by the household staff. At the far end of the corridor, tucked into a corner most people in the estate had never seen, was a modest wooden door. He knocked softly. He heard a small rustling from inside, the sound of a chair being pushed back. Then the door opened, and Sophia stood in the narrow gap of yellow light, wrapped in an old wool cardigan pulled over a plain cotton nightgown. Her eyes were still red-rimmed. Her hair had been let down for the night, dark and wavy over her shoulders. She froze at the sight of him. "Please, Sophia, come in with me. Do not stand at the door." She stepped back into the small room, and he followed. He closed the door quietly behind him. The room was narrow and clean, a single bed against one wall, a worn dresser, a crucifix on a nail above the pillow. On the bed, beneath a thin quilt, Emma was asleep, her small body curled on its side, her curly hair spread across the pillow. The one-eyed rabbit was tucked beneath her chin, held in place by a fist so small it could have disappeared inside Lorenzo's palm. Lorenzo sat down slowly on the wooden chair by the dresser. Sophia sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to wake her daughter. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Sophia," Lorenzo said quietly, "I need you to tell me everything, from the beginning." She looked down at her hands. Her tears began to fall in silence. She told him about her husband, a mechanic named Tommaso, who had died in a car accident on a wet road outside their village in Sicily nearly 2 years ago. She told him about the months after, when she and Emma had lived on almost nothing. She told him about the distant cousin who had once done small favors for the DeLuca family, and who had written a letter of introduction for her when she had finally, in desperation, decided to leave everything behind and come to America. She told him about the first months in the house, when she had been so grateful for the work that she had almost not believed her own good fortune. Then she told him about the nights when Emma, wandering silently through the great house on those small bare feet, had seen things she was too young to understand and too small to be noticed. She told him about the times she herself had walked into the kitchen and known the way a mother knows that something in the room had just been done that was not meant to be seen. She told him about the day Serena had cornered her in the pantry. "If you open your mouth," Serena had said, in a voice as calm as a folded knife, "your little girl will not have a mother." Sophia had stayed silent. She had cried at night. She had been afraid, every hour of every day, for Emma. "I knew she was doing something to you, Don DeLuca," she whispered. "Emma tried to sign it to me. But who would listen to a housekeeper and a child who cannot speak?" Lorenzo laid a careful, respectful hand on her shoulder. "You protected your daughter. That is the only thing a mother can do." He looked toward the sleeping child. "No one will ever threaten you again. Not from this night forward." Sophia broke, not with the tears of fear. For the first time in years, the tears of a woman who had finally, at long last, been heard. The night before the wedding, it was tradition inside the DeLuca family. A tradition older than Lorenzo himself, older even than his father. On the eve of a Don's marriage, the highest men of the organization gathered in the family council chamber to give their blessing to the bride who would carry the DeLuca name. It was not a ceremony spoken about outside those walls. It was a rite, a closing of the ranks, a sealing of trust. 23 men sat around the long walnut table in the council chamber that night. The walls were paneled in deep red leather that had darkened with time. Portraits of 3 generations of DeLuca Dons hung along the long wall in heavy gold frames. Great-grandfather Alessandro, who had come from a small coastal town in Sicily with nothing but a knife and a name. Grandfather Enzo, who had built the first true empire of the family. And Vittorio, Lorenzo's father, painted in the last year of his life, his eyes still burning quietly out of the canvas, as though he had never fully left the room. Serena had been formally invited into the chamber, an honor granted only to future wives of the Don. She wore ivory white velvet, her dark hair swept up into a high, elegant knot at the crown of her head, a single strand of pearls at her throat. She was radiant that night, perfect, as she had always been perfect. Her father, Don Salvatore Romano, sat in the place of honor to Lorenzo's right, the seat reserved for the father of the bride. He was 65 years old, gray-streaked at the temples, dressed in a black 3-piece suit of exquisite cut. His eyes were the sharp, cold eyes of a man who had spent his entire life hunting quieter men than himself. Champagne was poured into slender crystal flutes. Cuban cigars were lit, and the pale blue smoke rose slowly toward the high coffered ceiling. The atmosphere was warm and ceremonial. Old capos leaned back in their heavy leather chairs and murmured to one another about weddings past. A few of them smiled at Serena with the awkward fondness of men who did not know quite how to look at beauty. Lorenzo rose to speak. Every eye in the room turned toward him. He wore charcoal again tonight, his father's old watch on his wrist. His hands rested lightly on the polished walnut of the table. "Before you give your blessing to my bride," he said, his voice calm and even, "I would like all of us to see something together. A small gift. A family story." He gave the faintest nod. Marco Ricci rose from his chair at the far end of the table and walked, unhurried, to the tall double doors of the chamber. He closed them. He turned the heavy brass lock. At two other doors along the side walls, Lorenzo's most trusted men, Nico and Bruno, both former soldiers who had served the family since they were boys, stepped quietly into position, their hands folded in front of them, their eyes steady. Serena blinked. For the first time all night, her smile hesitated. Don Salvatore set his glass of red wine down on the table very, very slowly. At the far end of the chamber, above the fireplace, a large concealed screen slid silently down from a recess in the ceiling and flickered to life. The air in the room froze. The screen brightened, and the kitchen of the DeLuca estate appeared in silent, high-definition clarity. The footage was time-stamped in the lower corner, 3 months and 2 weeks before, 11:17 at night. Serena, alone in the kitchen, in her silk robe, walking to the porcelain teapot, reaching into her pocket, the small glass vial, 2 or 3 practice drops into the steeping tea. The vial returned to the pocket, the casual glance at her phone. The clip cut cleanly to another, a different night, same motion, same vial, same drops, then another, and another. 17 entries, arranged in chronological order, compressed into just under 3 minutes of silent, undeniable footage. The dates advanced across the bottom of the screen, like the ticking of a slow, patient clock. Around the long table, not one of the 23 capos moved. The screen changed. Toxicology reports appeared next, one after another. 4 independent laboratories, 4 different letterheads, 4 separate signatures, all confirming the same substance in Lorenzo's blood, in concentrations consistent with sustained low-dose exposure over a period of several months. The name of the compound appeared in bold at the top of each report, and every man in that room old enough to have read a hospital chart understood exactly what it meant. The screen changed again. Photographs now, grainy but readable. Don Salvatore Romano, seated at the back table of a suburban New Jersey restaurant, speaking with a low-ranking DeLuca capo named Vincenzo Torre. Another photograph. Salvatore with a capo named Beniamino Falco. Another. Bank transfer records, encrypted call logs, transcripts of intercepted phone conversations, obtained by Marco's people, planted quietly inside the Romano communications network over a period of 5 months. The last document to appear was a single sheet of paper, a rough draft, marked in Serena's own handwriting, of the power of attorney she had asked Lorenzo to sign 6 months ago. The room was silent enough that the ticking of the old brass clock on the mantel sounded like a hammer. Serena had gone pale, genuinely pale. It was the first honest paleness Lorenzo had ever seen on her face in 3 years of knowing her. Don Salvatore slowly, very slowly, placed both of his hands flat on the surface of the walnut table. Lorenzo turned toward Serena. His voice was not loud. He did not need it to be. Every man in the chamber heard him. "You had the chance to be a member of this family, Serena. You chose to poison me instead." Serena looked back at him. She did not cry. She did not beg. She did not attempt any of the small, elegant lies she had spent 3 years perfecting. She simply looked at him with those cold, calculating eyes, the same eyes he had glimpsed for one honest second in the garden the night of the engagement party. Her voice was quiet. "How much do you know?" It was not a denial. It was not a plea. It was a question one might ask across a negotiating table. "Enough," Lorenzo said. Don Salvatore rose from his chair in a single sudden motion. His hand slid inside the front of his suit jacket. Marco was faster. But from somewhere beyond the chamber walls, from the deep, dark corridors of the estate, came a sound that turned every head in the room. The high, sharp shattering of glass. Serena and her father had not come alone. The tall leaded window of the council chamber shattered inward in a single explosion of glass. A team of Romano mercenaries had surrounded the estate hours earlier, moving through the outer gardens under cover of dark, taking positions behind the hedges his mother had shaped by hand 2 decades ago. They had been waiting for a signal. The signal had been Don Salvatore's failure to walk out of the council chamber alive and in command. When that signal did not come at the expected minute, they had chosen the alternative, a violent, decisive takeover of the DeLuca estate that would end the night with a new flag flying over the empire. That had been their plan. Lorenzo had planned differently. The night before the meeting, he had quietly summoned 30 of his most trusted soldiers into the estate. They had come in one at a time, through the service entrances, dressed as caterers and florists and drivers, They had taken positions on every floor, in the second-floor library, along the east and west corridors, in the shadows of the great staircase, on the roof, above the fountain of the front drive, behind the wine cellar door. They had been waiting since dusk. When the first window shattered, they answered. The sound of gunfire rose through the great house like a sudden storm. A chandelier came loose from its ceiling anchor in the front hall and fell with a heavy crystal roar onto the marble below. Portraits of the old dons were pierced clean through great-grandfather Alessandro, grandfather Enzo, the painted eyes of Vittorio, all bearing the marks of the night without ever changing their expression. Wooden doors older than the country splintered under boots. A tall gilded mirror at the top of the staircase came down in a slow, terrible cascade of gold and silver. Yet in the middle of it all, something strange happened to Lorenzo. The sound of the battle rose around him, and then, for the first time in 4 months, it arrived to him clearly. Sharp, immediate. Every footstep, every shouted order, every closing of a magazine into a rifle. His ears, released at last from the slow poison that had been quietly narrowing his world, were beginning to hear again. Downstairs, in the kitchen, Sophia had already lifted Emma into her arms. The one-eyed rabbit was pressed between their two chests. Marco had shown Sophia the hidden safe room in the lower basement 3 days earlier, in a voice so quiet she had almost missed it. In case of trouble. She had memorized the route without asking a single question. She carried Emma down the service corridor, down the narrow servants' staircase, through a door that most of the household did not know existed, and into a small, steel-lined chamber built beneath the foundations of the estate. The door sealed behind them with a soft, heavy click. Sophia held her daughter tightly against her chest. Emma did not cry. She simply looked up at her mother with those steady, dark eyes, and lifted one small hand. "We are safe." On the floors above, Lorenzo moved through the estate with cold, exact precision. He had grown up in this house. He knew every corridor, every corner, every hidden turn, every place a man could disappear and every place a man could be found. Marco coordinated from the study, a phone in each hand. Nico and Bruno stood guard at the locked door of the council chamber, where Serena and Don Salvatore sat pale and motionless beneath a portrait of Lorenzo's father. 40 minutes. 40 minutes was all it took. The Romano assault broke, and then it collapsed. Those who surrendered were bound. Those who did not were handled according to the older law of the family, in silence and out of sight. When at last it was over, Lorenzo stood alone in the great front hall. Ash and dust drifted through the air. Broken glass lay scattered across the marble like fallen stars. He heard, with perfect clarity, the sound of his own footsteps echoing on the stone. Sharp, clean, alive. Marco came up beside him. "It is finished, Don Lorenzo." Lorenzo nodded once. Then, without a word, he walked to the basement stairs. He descended slowly. At the door of the safe room, he knocked in a specific rhythm 3, then 2, then 1. The door opened. Sophia stood there, Emma still in her arms. Emma looked up at Lorenzo. Then she lifted one small hand and signed a single word. "Safe?" Lorenzo lowered himself down onto one knee, until his eyes were level with hers. His hands were steady. "Safe." Dawn came slowly. The estate was quiet now, except for the soft sound of workmen moving through the front hall, unfolding heavy tarpaulins over the shattered windows, sweeping up broken glass into large canvas bins. The chandelier that had come down in the great front hall lay in glittering ruin against the marble, its silver frame twisted, its remaining crystals catching the first pale rose of the morning light. A cool October wind moved through the open frames of the leaded windows and stirred the fallen petals of the roses in the garden beyond. Serena and Don Salvatore had been handed over shortly before dawn, not to the police. Never to the police. They had been handed over to the Council of the Five Families, the quiet, ancient tribunal that governed the affairs of the underworld, the way an unspoken constitution governs a country that has no book to write it down. What happened in that room was decided by an older law. It was a law Lorenzo did not need to witness. He had asked only one thing of the council, that his mother's rose garden not be dishonored by the sight of it. By sunrise, the assets of the Romano family had been frozen by order of the council. Bank accounts, properties, shipping interests along the New Jersey coast, restaurants in 3 cities, the empire Don Salvatore had spent 40 years assembling, brick by careful brick, had ceased to exist between the hours of midnight and dawn. In the kitchen that morning, Sophia stood at the sink with her hands trembling on the edge of the porcelain. She had washed the same coffee cup 3 times without noticing. Lorenzo stepped through the doorway. He was still in the same clothes from the night before, but he had washed his face and combed his hair, and his eyes had the steady clarity of a man who had slept perhaps 2 hours and did not need any more. "Sophia," she turned quickly, drying her hands on the towel at her waist. "I want you to know something," he said. "From today, you are no longer a housekeeper in this house. You are family. Emma is family." He held out a plain white envelope. Inside was a trust, permanent, notarized, ironclad. School fees for Emma from now until she chose to stop learning. Medical care for both mother and daughter. A stipend that would ensure Sophia never again had to accept a threat from anyone in order to keep a roof over her child's head. Sophia took the envelope with both hands. She did not open it. She did not need to. She began to cry. Not the tears of fear. For the first time in years, the tears of freedom. From the corner of the kitchen, Emma sat on the tall wooden chair at the breakfast table, the one-eyed rabbit clutched carefully in her lap, watching the two adults with her steady, serious eyes. She lifted a small hand. Now Mama does not have to cry at night anymore. Lorenzo crossed the kitchen and knelt slowly in front of her. He signed back, unhurried, letting each shape settle in the morning air between them. "No, never again. And you too, Emma, you never have to be afraid again." Emma looked at him for a long, thoughtful moment. Then she reached out with both small hands and offered him the one-eyed rabbit. Lorenzo received it with both hands, solemnly, the way a man receives a promise. 3 months later, autumn had settled deep into New York. The yellow leaves fell one by one over the rose garden, where Elena DeLuca had once knelt in the soft, dark soil in her straw hat, and the peacock head she had shaped with her own hands still stood, quiet and patient, along the far wall. The fountain still murmured. The old house still stood, but the house had changed. Lorenzo's hearing had returned to about 85% of what it had once been. Dr. Bianchi had told him, in his quiet way, that he had been very lucky. Only 2 more months of the slow poison, and the damage would have been permanent. Lorenzo did not think of it as luck. He thought of it as a barefoot little girl with a one-eyed rabbit, sitting on a cold stone step in the dark. Inside the estate now, there was the sound of a child laughing in the evenings. Small footsteps running down the marble hallways where once only the echoes of power had lived. Emma had her own room now, the room that had once belonged to Elena DeLuca herself, on the sunny east side of the 2nd floor. On the walls, her finger paintings had been framed and hung like small pieces of gallery art. Beside her bed sat a brand new stuffed rabbit, this one with both of its eyes, a gift from Lorenzo the first week she had moved upstairs. But the old one-eyed rabbit had been given a place of honor on a small shelf above the headboard, where it watched over her while she slept. Sophia had begun her studies at a nearby university. In the Department of Social Work, every tuition and fee paid quietly, in full, by Lorenzo. She had wanted, she told him once over morning coffee, to help other mothers who had no one to listen to them. Lorenzo had relearned sign language completely. He had also made it a requirement, softly stated, but firmly meant that every member of the DeLuca family under his roof learn it as well. It was, he told them, a language the household would now know. Sometimes life sends the truth to us not from the loudest voices, but from the smallest ones, from the people the world has long ago learned to overlook. Never underestimate a child. Never underestimate a quiet act of kindness, and never assume that you know everything about the person sitting closest to you at the table. Now we would love to hear from you. Have you ever been saved by someone you least expected? Has there ever been a person in your life who tried to warn you about something you did not listen to at the time? Please share your story in the comments below. We read every single one, and your words often become the reason someone else feels a little less alone tonight. If this story touched your heart in any way, please take a moment to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, turn on the notification bell so you do not miss what is coming next, and share this video with someone you care about. Your support is what keeps stories like this one reaching people all over the world. From all of us here, we wish you and your family a week filled with peace, with good health, with quiet joy, and with the company of people who truly love you. May your days be gentle and your evenings warm. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we will see you in the next story. Goodbye for now.